What is fair use? Let's start by looking at the context when fair use might be applicable. Basically, copyright infringement. So this slide lists all the usual 106 rights that a copyright owner has. But importantly, it says at the very top that whether or not these rights exist are subject to exceptions. And the highlighted section, section 107, is the fair use exception to copyright infringement. So what you should see from this slide is that fair use is an exception to all of the listed 106 rights, which is different than some of the statutory exceptions that apply that are limited only to some of the listed rights. So now that we know that fair use is quite important as an exception to any of the 106 rights, let's look at it in a little more detail. Okay, so this is the beginning of the fair use statute. What you should notice is that it says that fair use, if it exists, is not an infringement. In other words, if there is an actual fair use defense under the statute, the defendant who's claiming fair use is not at all liable. It is a complete defense to copyright infringement. Now, importantly, when you win on fair use grounds, you don't owe any money at all to the plaintiff. There's no fee required unlike other exceptions to copyright provisions about compulsory licenses. You don't owe anything at all to the plaintiff. That said, usually fair use is something that takes time to litigate. It's a pretty fuzzy defense. So even when you win, you likely will have spent quite a lot of money on attorney fees. Now, what else can we see here? Well, there is a bunch of listed activities that I have in red that the statute says: criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. Are these per se fair use? Short answer is no, because the last sentence says that in evaluating whether something is in fact fair, there are factors that will be included, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So you might be wondering, why bother listing these if they're not actually fair use? Well, this is trying to give you an example. Just like in the Copyright Act, there are lists of categories of copyrightable works, even though that's separate from the basic test for what is copyrightable, fixed with minimal creativity. So this is giving you some examples so you can try to see context even though there is a separate test. Okay. Now, what else do we know? Well, first is that fair use is not an exception to the newer rights provided copyright owners that prevent circumvention of digital rights management. That's a major distinction from all the other 106 rights. And also, you should know that fair use is an additional thing beyond Creative Commons. So in other words, if you have a Creative Commons license, then you don't have to worry about fair use. So Creative Commons licenses are a specific way that somebody who's a copyright owner can license the work very conveniently to a lot of people. So in this example, it says non-commercial. So that means someone using the work could use it for any school project and not have liability. It's very clear, unlike the fair use statute, what would work. But if you use a work under Creative Commons for a use that's not licensed, for example, if the license is only for reproductions but not derivative works, and you do a derivative work, then you might still need fair use. But this is just to remind you that fair use is in addition to other things like Creative Commons. Okay, now, in the big picture, on the left, we have the actual factors for evaluating fair use. And in assessing fair use, the court considers all of the factors, but you do not need a certain number to exist. Rather, it's an overall weighing balancing test. Now, I've put in a different color the nature of the copyrighted work because that is really important to what I have shown you here on this slide. So in the middle of the slide are what I would call highly creative expressive works, works with, quote, thick copyright protection. So in generally, things that are highly creative, as opposed to the things on the outer part of the slide that are closer to facts and ideas, you're going to give more protection to what we consider the core of copyright. So if it's highly creative, it's less likely to be fair use unless the defendant's use is transformative work or it's a transformative use, because those are also things that we recognize as important for society. So transformative in that it's a totally different creation where you're adding important expressive content. So that's a big picture overview of fair use. Hope it's helpful.